There is a story unfolding right now that almost nobody is connecting the way it should be connected. The president of the United States flew to Beijing this week with the chief executive of Boeing, sitting in his delegation, and from a state dinner inside the Great Hall of the People, Donald Trump went on Fox News and told Sean Hannity that Xi Jinping had just agreed to order 200 Boeing jets. 200. Boeing wanted 150. The president said they got 200. Now think about how that sentence is supposed to land. It is supposed to land as a triumph, as proof that the trip worked, as evidence that the world's two largest economies are talking again, that American manufacturing is back, that the man in the room knows how to close. And in the framing of the visit, that is exactly how it was sold. But within minutes of the announcement, Boeing's own stock fell almost 4%. Within an hour, Wall Street analysts who had been tracking this deal for months were on television explaining why a 200-jet order, what would be the largest single Chinese commitment to Boeing in nearly a decade, was being treated by the market as a disappointment. And about 3,000 kilometers to the north, in a quiet town called Mirabel, just outside Montreal, the Canadian Prime Minister was watching the same news. Mark Carney has reason to watch it carefully because 8 days earlier on a single afternoon in that same Quebec town, Carney had quietly signed the largest order for a Canadian-built commercial aircraft in the entire history of this country. Most coverage is treating these two stories as if they belong on different pages of the newspaper. They do not. Over the next few minutes, I am going to show you exactly what happened, why it happened in this order, and why the contrast between what Donald Trump brought back from Beijing and what Mark Carney already had in his pocket may be the most revealing economic story of the year so far. Here is what actually happened in Beijing. On the second day of his state visit to China, President Trump sat down for a televised interview with Fox News host Sean Hannity. He had spent the day in meetings with President Xi Jinping. He had attended a state banquet at the Great Hall of the People. And during the interview, he said this: Xi had agreed that very day to order 200 Boeing aircraft. He used the phrase 200 big ones. He emphasized the jobs. He repeated twice that Boeing had asked for 150 and that he had pushed the number to 200. The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, had been signaling for days that a large Boeing order was coming. The Boeing chief executive, Kelly Ortberg, had personally flown with the president as part of a delegation of senior American business leaders. That delegation included the chief executive of Apple, the chief executive of BlackRock, the chief executive of Tesla, and the head of Goldman Sachs. This was, by any measure, the most concentrated assembly of American corporate power to visit Beijing in years. And the headline they wanted to bring home was Boeing. That is the official framing. The operational timeline tells a different story. For nearly a decade, Boeing has been effectively locked out of the Chinese market. The freeze began with the global grounding of the 737 MAX after 2 fatal crashes, and it deepened as trade tensions between Washington and Beijing escalated through 3 different presidential terms. Between 2018 and the start of this year, Boeing has delivered just over 100 aircraft to Chinese customers, in total about the same number of MAX jets that Chinese airlines accepted in a single year in 2018 alone. During that drought, Boeing's main competitor, the European manufacturer Airbus, moved in. Airbus did not just take some of China's business. Airbus took almost all of it. In 2019, China's national aviation regulator placed a single order for 300 Airbus aircraft. Multiple large orders followed. By this year, Airbus had built a position in the Chinese market that aerospace analysts describe as dominant. China is on track to become the world's largest aircraft market within the next 20 years. Its commercial fleet is expected to roughly double to nearly 10,000 aircraft. Boeing being shut out of that market is not a quarterly problem. It is an existential problem. So when reports began circulating earlier this year that Boeing and Beijing were negotiating a major package, the numbers being discussed were enormous. Bloomberg News reported in March that the deal could involve up to 500 narrow-body 737 MAX jets. Reuters reported similar figures sourced from industry insiders. The investment bank Jefferies modeled a potential order of 500 to 600 aircraft, with another roughly 100 wide-body jets, the larger, longer-range planes on top of that. By the time the president's plane touched down in Beijing, the prediction markets were assigning an 82% probability to a major Boeing announcement. The expectation, in other words, was not whether. It was how big. 200 jets is a real number. 200 jets is, by the standard of the last 8 years, a significant return to a market Boeing badly needs. But 200 jets is also less than half of what the market was modeling. And in the announcement Trump made on Fox News, the president did not specify which aircraft were included. He did not name the airlines that would take delivery. He did not say whether the agreement was a firm contract, a preliminary framework, or a political commitment that still needs to be turned into signed paperwork. He said 200 big ones. He said it was a lot of jobs. The market priced what the market saw. Boeing shares fell by roughly 4% in afternoon trading, their largest single day decline in months. One U.S. senator publicly warned that China has, in his words, never lived up to one contract it has ever signed. The shares regained some ground later in the session, but the message from professional investors was clear. The number was the headline. The details were missing, and the details are where deals like this either become real or quietly disappear. That is the first piece of the story. Now, hold all of that against what happened in Quebec 8 days earlier, because the timing matters more than almost anyone has noticed. On the 6th of May, Mark Carney walked into a hangar at the Airbus Canada facility in Mirabel, just north of Montreal. He stood next to the Premier of Quebec, Christine Fichette. He stood next to the chief executive of the commercial aircraft division at Airbus, Lars Wagner, and he stood next to Tony Fernandez, the co-founder of one of the largest low-cost airline groups in Asia, the Malaysian carrier AirAsia. And in that hangar, they signed an order for 50 Canadian-made 220 jets with options for another 150. The list price value of the firm portion of that order is approximately $19 billion, $19 billion in aircraft, every single one of them to be assembled in Mirabel, Quebec. It is the largest single firm order ever placed for the A220 program in its entire history. It is, in the words of the Prime Minister's office itself, the largest order for a Canadian-designed and Canadian-produced commercial aircraft ever signed anywhere in any decade. And it pushed the A220 program past 1,000 total orders for the first time. Now consider what that means in practice. The A220 traces its origins back to Bombardier, the Quebec aerospace company that designed the aircraft, originally called the C-Series before, nearly going bankrupt and selling the program to Airbus in 2018. The province of Quebec had invested $1 billion US into the program to keep Bombardier solvent. For years, the question hanging over Mirabel was whether the line could even survive. Airbus was producing only 7 or 8 A220s a month. The break-even rate was 14 a month. Local economic development authorities in the region had spent years quietly worrying about layoffs. This order changes that calculation completely. The AirAsia agreement gives the Mirabel facility a backlog deep enough to anchor production into the 230 Air. It locks in work for more than 4,600 assembly staff, more than 4,600 Canadian aerospace workers, whose jobs are now secure for years. It supports more than 850 Canadian suppliers, from machine shops in the Laurentides region north of Montreal to engineering firms in the city itself. It transforms Mirabel from a struggling program into one of the largest commercial aircraft success stories Canada has ever produced. The Prime Minister himself addressed the AirAsia chief executive directly at the ceremony. He thanked Tony Fernandez for, in his words, the trust being placed in Canadian workers in Quebec and in Mirabel. He said Fernandez was choosing the best at exactly the right time. It was not a speech designed to make American headlines. It was a speech designed to make Canadian payroll stable for the better part of a decade. And it happened with almost no American attention. There is one more layer here that you need to understand. AirAsia is a Malaysian airline. Malaysia, like much of Southeast Asia, sits inside the wider Chinese economic orbit. The A220 program in Mirabel is co-owned by a European manufacturer, Airbus, and by the province of Quebec, which holds a 25% stake. Production lines for U.S. customers are run separately at a facility in Mobile, Alabama. The Mirabel line, the one that just received this $19 billion order, builds aircraft for the rest of the world, including increasingly customers across Asia. In January of this year, Mark Carney became the first Canadian Prime Minister in nearly a decade to visit Beijing. He met with President Xi. He met with the Premier Li Qiang. He met with the chairman of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, Xiao Lei. He signed a new strategic partnership covering trade, energy, and aerospace. In that same agreement, China explicitly committed to looking forward to Canadian investment in aerospace and advanced manufacturing. He came home with a preliminary deal on canola. Tariffs. Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola seed were scheduled to drop from a combined rate of roughly 85% down to approximately 15%. That single change unlocks roughly $3 billion in Canadian export orders. And in the same package, Carney set a national target to increase Canadian exports to China by 50% by the year 2030. That visit happened 4 months before Donald Trump flew to Beijing this week with the Boeing chief executive. In his delegation, 4 months before Carney was there first. He met the same leaders. He signed papers in the same Great Hall, and he was there with a strategy that did not depend on a single press conference to define whether it had succeeded. And here is where the two stories intersect in a way that should concern anyone watching the global trade map being redrawn in real time. The standard framing of this week's news is that Donald Trump went to China and brought home a Boeing order. The standard framing of last week's news, to the extent it was reported in the United States at all, was that Airbus signed a deal with a Malaysian airline. Those framings miss what is actually happening. What is actually happening is that two North American leaders are pursuing two completely different strategies for engaging with the Asian aviation market, and the early scoreboard is not what the headlines suggest. The American strategy is loud, transactional, and dependent on a single leader's ability to deliver a number on stage. The Canadian strategy is quiet, structural, and tied to factories that already exist on Canadian soil, building aircraft that Canadian workers already know how to make. One strategy delivered a 200 aircraft commitment whose details remain uncepted. The other strategy delivered a 150 aircraft firm order with options for 150 more signed and announced inside a working assembly line with the Prime Minister of Canada in the room. Consider the numbers side by side. 200 Boeing aircraft, type unspecified, value undisclosed. Contract status unclear. Announcement made through a television interview. A 50A 220 aircraft. Model specified. Value approximately $19 billion. Contract firm options for another 150. Signing ceremony held inside the Mirabel facility. Formal press release issued by the Prime Minister of Canada, by Airbus, by AirAsia, and by the province of Quebec. The math does not resolve cleanly into the story the United States wanted to tell this week. And the deeper point is this. When Boeing was shut out of China for nearly a decade, the global aviation industry adjusted. airlines that needed narrow-body aircraft for. Asian routes did not stop ordering. They ordered Airbus. They ordered the A320 family. They ordered the A220. They built fleets that depend on European and Canadian production lines. And those production lines did not sit idle waiting for American policy to stabilize. They expanded. They took the work. They built the relationships. The Mirabel order is one piece of that larger reality. There is a particular irony in the Mirabel story that deserves to be named. The aircraft now being assembled there, the A220, was originally a Canadian design. It was developed by Bombardier as the series. Bombardier nearly went bankrupt building it. The province of Quebec poured $1 billion US into the program to save it. And then in 2018, Bombardier handed the entire program over to Airbus, essentially for free. At the time, that transfer was treated in Canadian financial pages as a defeat. A Canadian company forced to give away its best technology to a European competitor. 8 years later, that same program, now under European management on a Canadian assembly line, has just received the largest order in its history. The aircraft Canada, once almost lost, has become the aircraft Canada is now selling to the world. That story is not over. With the AirAsia order in hand, Airbus is now seriously considering whether to launch a stretch version of the A220, an aircraft that would compete even more directly with Boeing's 737 MAX, the same aircraft Trump is now trying to sell to China. What the Trump administration is now trying to do is reverse a decade of lost ground in a single week of negotiations. The 200 jet announcement, if it is firmed up and delivered, will help. Boeing badly needs it. American aerospace workers badly need it. But it does not undo what happened during the years Boeing was absent. It does not unwind Airbus's dominance in Chinese deliveries. And it does not change the fact that on the other side of the same continent, Canada has spent the last 12 months quietly building a parallel strategy that is now starting to pay off. There is one more contrast worth naming. The Canadian approach to China under Mark Carney has been described by his own government as pragmatic, interest-based, and aimed at strategic autonomy. Canada continues to maintain tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles.